In this lesson, we will talk about creating your own packages. So in the situation that you want some functionality in multiple projects, in your own projects, maybe for some client projects, and you feel that just having some kind of class or repository or service is not enough, you want to extend that into a package which would be available on GitHub and via Composer. And here I will use my own tutorial written more than 3 years ago, but also updated for Laravel 5.6 at the time. 5.7 doesn't make any difference. Here I will show you how to create a package. First, we need to create, well, there are multiple ways to do that, but here's my way, and it worked for a few of my own packages and for my team. So inside of your existing Laravel project, you create a folder called packages, and then you need to create a vendor and a package name. So every package, not sure if you noticed that it has vendor name or person name or company name / package name, like Spatie, for example, Laravel Media Library, something like that. So we call our package, in this case, Laravel Time Zones, and it will be just a simple package of showing the time in a specific time zone with parameter. So we create a folder, packages Laravel Daily Time Zones. Then inside of that package we need to create a folder called source, src, and then inside of that we go in our terminal into that Laravel Daily Time Zones and run Composer in it. And it's a guide with a question set, so who is the creator of the package, what is the license, what are the authors, all of that. And it generates something like this for you. So Composer JSON structure with some of your data, and it will be used for publishing the package in Packagist and on GitHub. And you can skip that, or you can have only some of them generated and then fill it in manually in Composer JSON in the editor. Then we need to load the package inside of our project, and this is one way of doing that. This is kind of an older version of that. In newer articles I see people doing PSR4, adding just Laravel Daily Time Zones into PSR4, but this also works. And then we need to run Composer update to actually use that package inside of our Laravel project. And in this article, everything happens in the same Laravel project. So package is kind of a part of that project, and later we will extend it into GitHub repository and Packagist. So we kind of registered the package, but it doesn't do anything yet. Next step is we need to create a service provider. Service provider is a class that actually registers some things, and you need to put that in src with the name something service provider. In my case, I call it Time Zone Service Provider, and it has two methods, boot and register. And for now, we leave it blank. We don't do anything yet. Next, what we need to do is to use auto discovery function from Laravel 5.5 and later, so people wouldn't have to add our own provider into their config app file. So to avoid that, Laravel 5.5 introduced auto discovery, and we need to specify in our package in Composer JSON what service provider needs to be auto discovered. Now let's actually create our package, create the logic and what it actually does. For that, we will have time zones controller, and it will show the time in the specific time zone. So for example, you will run the URL with get parameter time zone equals something, and it will show just carbon time zone with datetime string. With controllers, of course, we have to have routes file, and we create that inside of our src folder. Notice the controller is also inside of src folder, so just a controller. Then inside of src we have routes and web, which is totally the same as just general Laravel package, Laravel project, and we add one route there, so time zone / for example UTC or Europe London or whatever. And now we get back to our service provider, and we actually need to register both. So we register our routes web and that file actually can be called differently. You can call it routes.php, or you can have a subfolder in a different way. That's your call. And then we need to make our controller with Laravel time zones, and don't forget the namespace. Namespace is pretty important here. So you can Google this article, how to create Laravel 5 package, and you can do the same here. And that's it. It works. So we load the time zone /UTC, and it works, and it shows the time. But there are a few more details to unpack with this package. To have a parameter which could be optional, so then we can replace, well, do some string magic. If there is a time zone, we do some magic, otherwise we return just carbon now. So it would work with and without the parameter. We can also add views. So before that, in the controller, if we go back, our controller just returns the string on the screen without any design like that, without any fonts. But of course we can add the views, and we create a folder, subfolder src/views, and then we copy default Laravel 5 and add one variable, current time. That's it. And in our service provider we need to register. In this case it's not register function, it's in boot function. You load views from the views, and this is an important parameter. This is how you will call your views. So time zones is a namespace for the views, and this is how it will work. So this name of time zones goes to here. So time zones, time. That's it. So time will be the name of the view. So time blade PHP inside of that time zones namespace. And we reload the browser, and the font is different, and it still shows the time. Probably the last thing is publishing the view. So for example, if someone else wants to change the views, the project that uses your package, they want to customize it, they don't want the default ones, you just, inside of your boot method, again in service provider, you add this line. So publishes the views, and as soon as someone runs vendor publish, the views will be published, and you will have both inside of that package. You will have time blade PHP, but it will be copied into publicly available resource views, and you will be able to use that and to customize it without editing the vendor folder. So I guess that's it. That's a simple package. Of course, it may be much more complicated with migrations and with more service providers and artisan commands and all of that. But this is not the purpose of this course. So I just wanted to show you a demo of a simple package. And finally, to be able to use it inside of your project, you need to do two things. First, you need to upload it to GitHub, and you need to upload this specific folder. So this specific folder, Laravel daily time zones. So inside of here you do git init, git commit, and all of that. So the package source would be composer.json in the main folder, and then everything else inside of src. So you put it on GitHub, and then you register it on Packagist. I will show you my own Packagist for Laravel daily team. We have 4 packages. They're not really updated recently, but still it works. So if you want to register your own, submit your own package, you just put the Git repository, and then Packagist takes care of everything else. The most important part is for your composer.json to contain the necessary data. Yep, so I guess that's it. Then you register into Packagist. Well, first you register into Packagist, then add your own package, and that's it. Then you can use your package. So with this kind of simple steps, you can create your own package to use in your other projects. In this lesson, I want to show you one package that may help you structure your Laravel applications in a modular way. So there is a package by Nicholas Widdart, author of Asgard CMS, where he reuses that package to make a modular structure. And package is pretty popular, 2,000 stars and a few years old already, so it has versions and it has followers. And how does it all work? It basically offers you to structure your application in modules folder, and every subfolder is some kind of a module. So for example, you have a blog as a separate module or a shop for a separate module. In my case, I tried it with the module FAQ. I thought it's a pretty good example because FAQ is kind of a separate thing that you could work on, whatever project you have. You may have like terms and conditions, FAQ page, and then if a new developer starts with your team, he could work only on FAQ module structure and he would know where to find the stuff. Now, how does it all work? Installation of a package is pretty simple. You just install the package, you publish the vendor, and then that's important thing. You edit your Composer JSON PSR4 to have modules folder autoloaded, and then don't forget to run Composer dump autoload afterwards. And I've done it already, and I will show you the whole thing, how it's been done. So this is where it starts. Composer require, artisan vendor publish, Composer dump autoload, and that's it. And then you can make new module by running artisan command module make FAQ. I called it FAQ, and it creates a folder in modules, so folder called FAQ for the module name. And then the structure of a module is also generated for you automatically, the folders, and it's really similar to typical Laravel project, like you would create a new Laravel project. So it's a mini Laravel project inside of your main project. And it's really convenient. The structure is really familiar. Controllers, config, middleware routes, database, migration, seeders, everything is inside of it. It's just separated into your modules FAQ folder. Now, after creating the module, I've created the structure for the module. This is the list of files. So I start with models, and my module will consist of two models. I've messed up with the syntax a little, but then it succeeded. So there are separate artisan commands to generate something inside of the module. So module make model, FAQ category, and FAQ question, and then it generates these files. For some reason, Nicholas, the author, called it entities, so it's not models or it's not inside of app folder, it's entities. But inside of it, it's a general Laravel eloquent model, so nothing really new here, it's really familiar. So I've created a model category with questions with relationships, and then FAQ question model with, again, a relationship back to belongs to category. After models, I've made the migrations for them, for both. So make migration, and all the artisan commands require a parameter what module to stick that in. And migrations are also a familiar thing. So database migrations, two files, and the same good old Laravel syntax. So just fields, foreign keys, timestamps, and everything you need. So you do migrations. Then I tried to make a controller, but system told me that controller already exists. Then I went to that FAQ model HTTP controllers, and this was pre-generated for me, except for this one. So this was the line I've added. So this was pre-generated for me, like that. It was like that by default. So it generates a general resourceful controller with FAQ index as a view. And then that view, notice that it's prefixed with namespace. So it also generates resources views index. And that index extends also namespace FAQ layouts master. So if you want to change anything in master, you have full HTML control. Or in index, you do whatever you want. And then I started to fill in the content. So for FAQ controller, I'm getting all the categories with questions, passing it into the view, and then doing for each magic to show that FAQ. And I will show you how it works actually. So this is the final result. Page/FAQ, which I didn't actually build myself. It also comes with routes, which are automatic. So routes, web, PHP, this was generated. So prefix FAQ and main page. So this was also generated, and the page just works. What I've done also is seeders. So seeders can be also generated here. So make seed, and then you end up with database seeds files. So the main is FAQ database seeder, and then I've created a separate class, seed FAQ questions table seeder, with some dummy questions. Well, semi-dummy. It's pretty real. It's pretty real in the real life examples. Just seeded the data, and then what I've done a little differently, I've published the migration. So you can publish some stuff from your module. I think it's config. Wait, I'll find it actually. Artisan commands, and publish migration, publish config, and publish translations. So in my case, I need to publish migrations on top of the existing ones previously. So it copied the migration files, and then I was able to run PHP Artisan migrate like it was in the main project with 2 tables then created, and then I needed to run module seed, but not db seed, not the main. So seeds weren't published. I just ran module seed FAQ. And that's it. Basically, that's a simple module FAQ which contains almost typical Laravel structure and could help you to structure your project in a modular way. So in addition to FAQ, I would, as I said, I would be able to create module shop, for example, or blog, or whatever else you want, and then people who work with FAQ module, for example, they encounter the bug or something, they know exactly where to find all the structures for that exact module. In this video, we will analyze an open source package, or rather project, called Accounting. And the purpose of this video is to analyze its structure, the code structure, the architecture, the patterns that are used. So we can learn from the best solutions that are available on open source. And this is one of the better ones. It's on the market for more than a year. And it has, as you can see, 1,400 stars on GitHub. Really small amount of issues, and pretty well written. I've analyzed it offline, I've installed it, so this is how it looks, a dashboard for accountants. I'm not an accountant myself, so I cannot comment whether it works well from like accounting point of view, but I did analyze the code and the folders and the classes, and let's see how it is structured. In my Google Keep, I have notes, so this is kind of outline what you will see here in this video. So we will analyze Composer, what it contains, and then we will go from routes to controllers to models. So what is in routes file, how are controllers structured, what are private methods in controllers, and a lot of stuff. So jobs, some of the code is written in jobs, some of the code is in events and listeners. Then they also use traits quite a lot, which was a little surprising, but then it made sense why. They do use notifications function from Laravel. They use observer pattern, but only one observer. I will show you that. Then there's interesting pattern called overrides. So they override some basic classes, some core classes. Then there are utilities, which are used in installation commands and some installer functions. And then it's interesting to see how the tests are written, and specifically Cedar for the test. So we'll cover all of that. And as a bonus thing, so extra tools that are used, they use modules, Laravel modules package to structure the code. Then they use another package to filter Eloquent, which is also interesting. Then they use API, but since the package is Laravel 5.4. They didn't have the API resources available, so they use Dingo package with transformers. And final thing, we will discuss how they use public folder, which is not really typical. So all of that you will see in this video, and let's start from Composer. The package itself, if you go to accounting.com, I think it is, accounting.com, yeah, you can only download the package, so you cannot really clone from GitHub. Well, you can, but the recommended way is to download. And downloaded file, zip file, doesn't contain Composer, so you download it as a already pre-built thing. You don't have to install it. You don't need to do Composer install and all of that. It's done for you. It has Visual Installer. So Composer JSON is available only on GitHub here, but we can easily take a look at the code. And it's pretty big. There are a lot of packages used, but I want to pay your attention to a few things. First thing, Laravel 5.4, which is this. Another thing I want to point out, look at all the stars here. So they specify which version of each package to use, and that's a really good practice, because if you leave like 3-point star or even just 3-point anything, if that package releases a new version which is kind of a breaking version, breaking changes or some bugs introduced, then you might be screwed. But if you are tied to specific version, even that, like beta 8, so that is even more specific. But probably the third version, like after the second dot, is pretty safe to assume that version 2.3.19 would not break 2.3.1. So that is a really good practice. And then also it's a kind of a good practice if you have a huge application, or well, really large one, to have your own packages separate. So if you see, this is the package accounting/accounting, but underneath they have separate package for language, for money, for settings, for signed URLs, and for versions. And that is probably useful for them. So when you have a separate piece of code that you would like to specify to separate in a separate layer, have your own package is pretty good way to do that. I've seen various CMSs do that. Not sure, October CMS, I think, Typee CMS, they have like a base package, and then that package depends on a lot of other packages which are below. Even Laravel Framework is actually not a Laravel Framework, but it's a set of packages underneath. Even that, so Laravel Framework, Laravel Tinker is a separate, and then there's more. That's probably it from Composer.json. That's what I've noticed. Also, there are a few things with PSR4, so overrides, that's interesting, and modules, that's interesting, but we will discuss that along the way in the video. And now let's get to our main controller, actually to routes, and then let's start with routes, then we go to controller, models, and see how it's all structured. Okay, here I am in the main routes web file, which is really interesting, grouped really well, and let's see what we can learn from here. And we will learn routes and middlewares as well. So routes are structured in groups, and that is a really good way to have a group within a group, and you have as many layers as you want, and specifically for using different middlewares. So in this example, everything, all the routes are middlewared by language, and I will show you what is language later. So everything is under language. And then there is a group for authenticated users, so middleware auth, which ends a little further here. So there are some public routes, like for installation. So this is authenticated users block. And then within that, we have groups for uploads, for wizard, for admin menu, and a lot of other like income. Then there's domain-specific things like expensive banking reports, and it's just for having prefixes in URLs. But some of them are under middleware. And let's get to middlewares. What are they? It's a mix in this package, in this accounting. It's a mix of middleware provided by Laravel, which is auth, and then permission read admin panel, which is they're using what's the Composer.json, Lara Trust, I think it was. The package, yep, Lara Trust. It comes with permissions. And then the most interesting part is middleware language. I was trying to find what is language. Let's go to our kernel PHP, which usually is responsible for middlewares. And there are a lot of middlewares. And actually there are groups of middlewares. So wizard, admin, customer, and others. And there is language here. But what is language? If we're trying to find language middleware or something, there's nothing to be found. But then I realized that they use their own package. And how it works is in their Composer.json they have accounting language 1.0, and if we go to this package, there is a provider. In the main config app PHP, they have this. So among vendor service providers, they have their own language provider, which gets us to here. And in this service provider, they specify that alias middleware, alias language to config language middleware. It sounds pretty complicated, but it's kind of flexible. So then you need to look at config language middleware, and then again back to the main. You have config language here, and in config language you find this, and then you can understand that this class is specifically responsible for this constant, for this middleware. And if we look at that set locale, it's probably responsible for just applying the languages, which is just setting the locale probably into sessions or date set locale, set default, set user locale, set system, and a lot of others. So yeah, it's pretty complicated for middlewares within the routes. And final thing, which will lead us to controllers. Let's see how they use controllers. So for most of the routes file, they don't use resource, which is kind of a weird thing, but sometimes it is more readable. So for example, currencies, create, edit, enable, disable, probably they would be able to use resource, but they decided to split it into more methods, like enable, disable isn't part of resourceful controllers. So this is probably more readable and more useful to them. But see that there are prefixes and namespaces for controllers. So they kind of divided controllers into many folders, specifically by domain, and there are specific for API, for common things, for installation, and a lot of that. And they use namespaces here in the routes pretty extensively everywhere. So every controller is namespaced with something. So that is also a good practice. But what I disagree with kind of is that they don't use controller name in the naming of the controller. So company's controller should be more appropriate, in my opinion, just because then we know that companies is a controller. So I imagine if you look at the whole project and search for companies, you will find a lot of things. Oh yeah, I was totally right. So there is a common, actually there are even separate controllers, so it's even more complicated. But there is a filter, there is a controller for this, for that, and model. There is a model in auth here with method companies. So I would kind of a great practice, in my opinion, to have currencies controller, companies controller, same with resource, not the resource, what was the request. I think they don't use requests as well. So request banking account, for example, extends request, I would call it account request, just for clarification, what is that file. So from the name of the file, you know what it is, controller, resource, or everything or anything else. So that is a brief overview of routes. I hope it was useful. Now let's go to controllers. Okay, let's pick some controller, and I've picked a dashboard, which corresponds to this view. When you log in, you see the dashboard, and that is probably one of the most complicated. It should be with a lot of numbers, so let's see how it is structured. This is the route, and we go to common dashboard PHP. And let's start with index, and let's see how it is structured. It's pretty small, so index function calls some other functions, some calculations, get this, get that, and then returns the view, which is okay. Let's see some more internal things. Date comes from the package, I think it was something with date. What I'm interested in is this one. So what I'm noticing in the dashboard, at least controller, there are a lot of private methods. So this get totals is a private method, which in retrospect it calls another method which is also private, calculate this, calculate amounts, and in reality this controller has only like 50 rows, so up to 75th row is controller functions with public, like route processing routes methods, and everything else from 70th row to like 400 something. So 80% of the controller is private methods. So that's the part I would disagree. I would probably list that somewhere in service in some other layer, but it works, it's fine, it's okay, and it's readable. It's pretty much readable. So private function get totals, then it again it calls calculate amounts, and this is where we'll probably finish with controllers because we need to get to models. This line is pretty interesting. It seems like a normal eloquent call, category with, where, and then some other like enabled. There's a scope, we will get to that too. But what is a category? Category is an eloquent model, and that is fine, except, and that also looks pretty familiar, simple, eloquent, nothing too major. But extends model is a custom base model for the whole project, and that is really interesting. It extends eloquent, and it probably repeats a lot of eloquent magic, but in the base model there are a lot of kind of global project scoped things that are needed. So filter is used with a package for filtering, we will get to that, but for example, scope company ID. And that is a great idea because a lot of the functionality, imagine the accounting service, there are everywhere. There are filters by company ID, there are filters by enabled, whether the record is enabled or disabled, scope by account, and filtering by account, scope by customer, vendor, a lot of scopes. And in all the database table, I assume they have fields like enabled, like customer ID, like vendor ID, account ID, and it's a really convenient way to have a base model with base scopes and then use, for example, scope enabled in the dashboard in here like this. So enabled, and probably that enabled is repeated throughout other. Let me find it. Maybe there's something here. No, probably not in this specific controller, but I imagine it is repeated elsewhere, and that is a good way to have a base model. Well, this here, account enabled. Let's see if it extends the same. Yeah, so account extends model, which has scope enabled. So if you have any global scopes or global variables that you want to filter by, that's a great way to have it as a base model, which you then extend. Next thing I want to talk about is jobs. So folder jobs or jobs classes that they dispatch here in the package accounting. And the example is in controller expenses bills in store method. So create a bill. For that they chose the jobs. And this is the question which ultimately comes back, where do I put the code? In this case, so you're creating a bill, which is a substantial piece of code. Where do you put that? In controller, it's too big. In the model, it's too heavy for the model. So this is where people create some other layer. Usually, from my experience, it's services. But in this case, they chose jobs, and I will show you why. It kind of makes sense, but it could be a service as well. I think so, because the jobs are usually used when there's something to queue some jobs one by one. In this case, it's not queuable. It's not queuable anywhere, but it performs the job, so it makes sense to structure like that. So what does it do? This job, create a bill. It creates the bill with Eloquent. Bill is just an Eloquent model. There's nothing too interesting there. It attaches the file with probably Spati Media Library, if I'm not mistaken, and then it calculates some totals. And for that, it creates another job. It dispatches another job, which is create bill item. So this is create bill, so full bill, and then create bill item is for item, which in itself calls bill item somewhere. Yeah, bill item create. Eloquent, again, Eloquent, some calculations, and then it returns bill item. Let's go back to our create bill job. So bill item is used then to calculate some totals, then discounts, then some totals more. That is an interesting thing. It overrides the request and then updates it with the request input. I'm not sure what is done here, why, but it works. Then we have this add totals, which is interesting thing. It's a private method within the same job. So it adds the totals records into the database. It's actually a protected function, but it's pretty similar. So it adds bill total with Eloquent model, another bill total for discount, for taxes, so a lot of saving within Eloquent. It doesn't return anything, and then the main job also adds bill history. So I imagine from accounting point of view, you do have to save a lot of records, related records, just for accounting purposes. Then we have bill create recurring. So create recurring bill is actually a trait. And trait is considered to be kind of a bad practice or last resort if you don't have any other pattern. But it does make sense in this case because recurring can be a lot of things. It could be bill recurring, it could be expense recurring, or income recurring, as I understand from accounting point of view again. So it does make sense to have a trait and then call it from wherever you want. What's interesting here that it's create recurring, and recurring trait isn't referenced in the job itself. So in this, you won't have recurring. It is referenced in the model. So app model expenses bill, if we click that one, this is where you find app traits recurring. So that is interesting. It's kind of referenced 2 levels deep. And final thing that is done within this job is the event. Event is fired, that bill is created. And I assume that the event will be responsible to send some notifications, maybe store some other data, and someone should listen to that. But the event itself is empty. As you can see, the constructor is really empty and there's nothing here. So let's find out where it is used, how it is used, and what classes actually listen to it. And the answer to this question, what the bill created is used for, is it's nowhere. It doesn't get used anywhere. If I search bill created throughout all the project, it's not attached to any listener. It doesn't have any listener. And usually you would find event service provider to tie the listeners. So listen which class with what listener. But bill created isn't in the list, which means that they kind of did that up front in the job. They fire the event, so this one, which is empty for now, but just in case it is created. So for the future developers, or for themselves, I guess, like for my future self, let's call it this way. But what we can find in event service providers is a few listeners that actually work, listeners and events. And particularly interesting is invoice paid. So invoice paid event is listened by invoice paid listener, which is, I'm not, again, I will repeat, I'm not a fan of this this naming of the class. It should be paid listener, because it doesn't, it's not clear by file name what the file actually does. So I would rename it. But anyway, let's get to paid PHP, which is this listener. And in this listener, you have actually handle, invoice paid as event. Actually, let's take a look at invoice paid, where it's actually being called invoice paid, event new. So PayPal standard, it's in controller, it's actually in modules, which we'll touch a little later. So it's a separate modules package, which calls that event with parameter of invoice and request, and then it gets to that listener, which is paid here. So invoice and request gets throughout these 2 parameters, and then there are some magic stuff happening with invoice paid. And again, listener has its own protected or private function to perform some action, and then so create payment is this protected method. And that is an interesting question. When should you have private methods or protected methods? Probably it is to shorten the main function. So instead of this being 100 lines, it is kind of a 30 lines, well, not 100, but 20 lines of code are extracted, refactored into separate function. And that does make sense. I agree with that. And also within that listener, it finally calls the notification. So user notify about invoice being paid. Let's see what is notification. The notification is actually this one. And that's another instance where I don't agree with the naming, because that line shouldn't exist. That line should be invoice notification. So something like that, and then it's all clear that invoice notification is actually a notification class. As it stands here, it is notification, and then we need to click to find out what it does. And this is a standard notification by Laravel. I think it was introduced in 5.3 or 5.4. It sends the email with attaching the PDF file for the invoice. So this is how it works with the events and listeners. And also in the modules, we will touch that a little later. But every module, it has two modules, offline payment and PayPal standard. It has their own listeners. So listen, no, not this one. So for example, their own providers. So module PayPal standard has PayPal standard service provider, which registers listeners like this one. So it's even more complicated. There are a few listeners for the main application, and also there are a few listeners for each module. Next part of that application accounting I want to show you is observers. And there is one observer for model company, and it looks like this. So the purpose of that is when the company is created, there is artisan call command to seed some company data and attach a company to the user, to the logged in user. And then another method is when the company is deleted, then delete items, like listed here, a lot of data related to the company. It's kind of a cascade delete, but done in Observer. And if we search in the code for observe, it's attached in Observer Service Provider. So that's another interesting thing. They use quite a lot of service providers, which then are registered in PHP, which is Observer Service Provider. So they don't pick, they don't specify this line in App Service Provider as I would do that, but specifically for observers, they create their own provider. Next interesting thing, well, I call all them interesting things or patterns in the accounting package, is utilities. So app utilities folder contains some classes. For example, class installer. Basically, from what I understand, the logic why it is called utilities and not services, not anything, it's mostly about some common things like housekeeping, like installing, uninstalling, versioning, info, some importing of data. So kind of it kind of makes sense to call it a utility and not a service, because for other things, as I mentioned before, they use jobs a lot, so a lot of jobs, but jobs are related to expense and income, and utilities are kind of system-wide global things. So for example, and it's simple class, so class installer, and they use static functions, so without any pattern, too much logic, injections or anything like that. Check server requirements, and it's checking in any variables, extensions of PHP, then something with env file, database, variables, create companies, some settings, and a lot of static methods basically. And it is called from artisan command. There is console command, quite a few commands as well. Most of them are also kind of utility things, so class install. As I mentioned before, they have Visual Installer in accounting, so it's not Composer install something, you download the zip file and you use like WordPress Visual Installer. So there is a command with a lot of potential parameters, and inside of that command, in handle method, you would see a lot of installer. So installer create this, installer create that, create company, create users, check options, and a few more installer calls. So yeah, create DB tables. If we search for install something, installer Oh yeah, so nothing more. But anyway, inside of console commands, like module install, there should probably be module installed event and module history. No, in this case it's not using utilities. But anyway, you get the point. So utilities are classes that are not related to domain, like accounting or expenses or income, but related to installing and some general info, which are then used mostly in console commands. Final thing I want to show you from app folder, final kind of pattern, it's called overrides. And I haven't used that myself before, I haven't seen that pattern, but it's really interesting again. Let's take a look at their Composer JSON. In Composer JSON they have PSR4, not PSR4, autoload app overrides. Let's get into that app overrides, and they have two classes, accounting signed URL and illuminate message selector. And what it does, basically, it overrides the core functions of Laravel into those classes. So with this pattern, they kind of change, for example, for signed URL, as I understand, they apply their own logic for expiration, for signature, for key, so configurable variables instead of core Laravel stuff. And if we search for signed URL in our project, signed URL, you would see some caching, offline payment. So offline payment class, which is inside of modules, use signed URL. So signed URL is part of core Laravel, but in this case it doesn't use the core Laravel. Instead it uses overrides thing. This is how it looks in, I'll show you, in autoload class map. So this is the part that it gets overridden. So instead of accounting signed URL, it uses overrides thing. And in this case, they override their own signed URL. But in other case, illuminate message selector gets overridden, message selector, illuminate translation. Interesting part is that in message selector, the namespace remains the same. So it's kind of illuminate, but in reality, it's used in overrides. And I don't necessarily agree with this approach, because imagine as a new developer, I come up with this code base and I need to signed URL. I need to understand that. I open this controller and I see use signed URL, and I assume that it's part of core Laravel, which isn't the case. So I need to understand that in Composer JSON it gets overridden by some other class. So I don't necessarily agree with that pattern, but as long as it works, and probably authors had some thought about it. Now let's take a look how accounting package does testing, automatic testing. If we look at tests folder, there's nothing in unit, so there are no unit tests, but there are a lot of feature tests, which basically means that they log in as some user, perform some action on some route, and assert that the status is good enough. So 200 or 302 in this case, so test quite a lot of feature tests basically. But what I wanna pay attention to is how they seed the data for those tests. So feature test case is the main class, abstract class, and in setup, parent setup for test case, they call artisan commands. They call a simple seeding with class test company. Test company is here. So for every company, they create a company, some private methods. So create company is here. Yeah, so create a company with domain test.com, change some settings for the currency, for the address and all that, and then create one user. So they create one company and one user. And then separately they call company seed, which is another artisan command. Let's take a look at that, company seed. Why is it a separate artisan command? Laravel make abstract company seeder. Company seeder, another seeder for the company. And this is interesting pattern or interesting way. They call a lot of seeds related to the company. Where are they? Database, seeds, here. So account seeder, categories, currencies, and a lot of that. And each of those classes has argument. So argument company, and that is really convenient to have company seeder. Wait, where is that called? Lost little test company. No, not that one. Yeah, this one. Set command this company seeder, and at some point, don't remember where exactly. Company seeder. They run those commands with company ID equals 1. Oh, right, this one. So in main test case, they run company seed with parameter company equals 1, which then gets into this one automatically inside of the actual seeder. So that's a great way if you have a lot of seeders for one global variable. In this case, it's a company. It may be a global user or global, I don't know, some other organization or something like that, or domain name. So that is quite a great way to separate those into separate seeders. Then have one main seeder for all of them, expecting one parameter which could be passed from artisan call, in this case from test case. And finishing thoughts about test cases and featured tests. There are quite a lot of them, as I said, and they are divided into various kind of sections, so expenses, incomes, but they are all pretty similar. Assert status and assert 302, which is enough to be sure that the project is working and it's not breaking with various types of data. So if we get the request, it fakes some data using Faker, which is really well-known package, and then basically I would write pretty much the same amount of tests, because the usual question is what tests to write, how to structure them, do we write unit tests or not. Of course it depends, but in this case this suite of tests is good enough to basically sleep well at night and almost be guaranteed that the main structure, the main CRUDs, the main get and post routes are working well. Okay, and in the last chapter of our video, it's time to wrap up with modules, with packages, external packages that are used by accounting. And I will mention 3 of them. Really briefly, I don't want to get too deeper into that. Maybe I'll shoot separate videos on those, but still, they need your attention. They deserve your attention. First one is modules by Nicholas Wittart, Laravel modules. It's pretty simple, but at the same time complex package. To structure your code into separate modules. So in this case, you're creating a module, just module make, and then you can create folder modules and name your module, and then do pretty much the same structure as it would be your Laravel app, the full app. So database, HTTP, resources, controllers, migrations, config, anything you want here. The only thing you actually need is to make it in Composer JSON PSR4, which is done exactly by the accounting package. Here you can see PSR4 modules, and in this case they have 2 modules, both related to payment, so PayPal standard. An interesting thing that they have routes, so every module has its own routes with its own namespaces and whatever they need. So it's kind of convenient. I'm still not sure if I would do that, if I would structure the module into a separate folder, like totally separate. But in this case, probably the module offline payment only works with that domain, with that offline payments, and PayPal standard is only working with PayPal. So it does make sense. If you want to check out the Laravel modules package, it's pretty popular, and it has version 4 already. And now let's move to another package that is used in accounting. It's Eloquent Filter. Haven't seen that before, found it just here from the accounting, and it seems to be a useful package, again with 500 stars. What it does, it allows you to filter Eloquent records not by this huge list of where clauses. For example, if you have mega search, search by query, search by dropdown, search by something else, and this is how it usually looks like in controllers. So a lot of where statements, a lot of if, where has, and a lot of those. And with this package you can put it to the array, and then that filter takes care of everything inside of the filter. And this is how it's used in the package in the accounting itself. So you can just, if we get back to documentation, you just make a filter. Where's the command? Yeah, so artisan model filter, and then in the filter you have the method for each of the where statements. So where search by, where vendors, categories, statuses, and build date. And in the accounting blade, there's a form with these exact parameters. So search is a text query, then vendors and categories are drop-downs, and then date range is build date. But this is camel case, no, not camel case, underscore with underscore, snake case, and this is camel case. So that's important part to remember. But in general, it's a useful thing to avoid filtering in controller. And final external package I want to mention here, but really briefly, is Dingo API. It's used in older Laravel versions, and if you notice that in some code base, app transformers, it's basically for API to return some model and transforming it into some, for example, ISO string with some other operations. And since Laravel 5.5, it was changed to API resources, which became a part of Eloquent. So you just make a resource and you just specify the array like this instead of using any external package. So that is it. My plan is over here. So we've reviewed the accounting package, which took much longer than I expected. I expected it to be like 10-15 minutes. It became like 40, I think. But I'm really curious, was it useful? Was it just me talking to the camera and just analyzing stuff, or was it actually useful to you? Did you find out anything new? Please add your comments. And if that is successful, then I will review more packages, more projects from open source, and we will both learn from them. See you guys in the next videos. In this video, we will review another open source package or project in Laravel and see the structure of it. So I tried to do that with another package called Accounting, and it took a really long time. It went like 40 minutes of video. So I'll try to make it shorter this time and point only the main things. So we're looking at Laravel.io, a project community portal by Dries Wintz, who is now an official Laravel employee number 3, I think, or number 4, I'm not sure about that. So Laravel.io, he was really a part of the community since the beginning. He created Laravel.io, he was really active on Twitter and in forums and in releases of the versions. So really kudos to him, and it's a good example, I think, to take a look at the code because it's publicly available on GitHub. So this Laravel.io portal, forum, events and community. And this is the Laravel.io portal repository, and let's analyze what about the structure. So how Dries structures his project, which is not very big, but big enough to learn something from it. And it has 1400 stars, pretty popular and considered to be pretty good. And usually when I start to analyze the project, I start with routes, because routes really show the scope of the project, the size of the project, the main endpoints, controllers, and structure. So routes are not that big, 83 lines of code, and what we can learn from these routes. First thing, Dries doesn't really use route resource, which was kind of a surprise to me. Instead, he does separately edit and update, for example, edit show, and it's more explicit. Maybe it's good, it's a personal choice. And same thing with auth routes. He doesn't use auth routes by default. It just it's copied and paste most of it, like password reset, like register, logout. it's almost the same as default auth routes, but probably he made some changes deep down below, so it made sense to override those URLs and to assign maybe different methods. I'm not sure about that. So these are two things, and then a few more interesting thing about like binding, for example. So if you go to controller, for example, email confirmation, email address code, this URL, and it goes to email confirmation controller confirm, which is this one. So this method. As you can see in routes, the parameter is email address and code. In the controller, it's user and code. So that route model binding, which is by default, it exists in all the resourceful controllers in Laravel, like create, store, edit, update, show, methods, all of that. They accept the parameters. But in this case, how it's all bound together. And the secret is a file called routes bindings PHP. I've never seen that used before. A pretty interesting thing. So separate routes bindings file where it actually being binded. So email address is a parameter, and then it is resolved by finding the address, by finding the user by email. So this way, email address gets resolved into a user. So that is another interesting thing that I've noticed in this routes file. And final thing about routes, you don't see middleware anywhere here. Middleware or any auth, so nothing, because it was given to controllers. So in the controller, you can assign middlewares, and that's also personal preference. You can assign middlewares either in controller construct or in routes. He also uses authenticate class, which is the same as auth, and also you can assign middleware to only some methods. So in this controller, email confirmation controller send is middleware by auth, and confirm isn't. So that's another interesting way of doing that. So that's the structure of routes in Laravel IO. Let's move further to jobs. So if we go to any controller, most of the custom logic, actually, let's go to app folder and let's see what folders do we have there. And I was expecting something like services and repositories, but it wasn't there. So where does all the logic go? And the answer is jobs. If we go to jobs folder, a lot of jobs are being done there. So confirm user on the forum, delete thread, delete user. So in the controller, usual code of the controller in this project is getting the data, maybe some checking, and if the action needs to be fired, then it's dispatching the job with a parameter. Also dispatching confirm user here, dispatching send email. So all the logic is inside of the jobs. And if we enter any job, it's usually pretty simple. So this could be potentially part of a controller even, or some kind of a service. So it's kind of 2 lines of code. But the author thought that it makes sense to make everything a job and then dispatch the job whenever you need. So that's one way of doing the architecture, and it's pretty good. I'm actually quite a fan of it. So if you dig deeper into that repository, you will find that jobs is the #1 thing that it's using. Then if we go into app folder, we also see helpers. Quite a lot of helpers, model helpers here. So for pagination, then for example receive replies. Let's just take a look. Latest replies, and how does it use all the helpers? It's a trait, actually, trait receive replies, and then maybe this is a trait as well. Yep, so this is a trait, and probably in Composer JSON it's auto-loaded. Let's take a look if helpers are here. Yes, files, resources, helpers. Well, that's interesting. There's another layer. So if we go to resources helpers, probably it will contain the list of those files. resources helpers. Oh no, it's even interesting. So that sounds to me, looks to me like WordPress file functions PHP. I'm not sure if you have any familiarity with WordPress. So that looks like just helper function. So yeah, so those helpers are not automatically loaded in Composer JSON. Probably they are loaded as soon as they are needed in some controllers. Let's double check. What do we have here? We don't have helpers here auto-loaded. Okay, fine. But then I guess question is why they're called helpers. I would then move those to folder traits. Folder traits isn't present here. So helpers are usually actually trait. Then there is, I've noticed one event, reply was created, but it's actually empty. So reply was created, and let's see if there is a listener for that. So another pattern of separating the logic is events and listeners. So if there is an event, there probably should be a listener. Send new replied notification. Yes, exactly. So one event and listener. If reply was created, then we need to notify all the users. So this is the logic, events and listeners, and probably there should be event service provider where it's all registered. Let's see. Yep, exactly. In app providers, event service provider, we have a listener registered and tied to event class. So that's another thing. Also, what I've noticed is folder called rules. And rules are just for validation. And basically, class implements rules. And if you search for, actually, I'm not sure if GitHub allows the search in that repository. In this repository, yep. Oh yeah, it is. It is used actually. Update reply request. Oh, it's interesting. So the repository has rules as a separate class and class list, and then those rules are applied in the array of another rule. So this is a typical form request class, and on top of required, there is another rule added as a array item. So that's also interesting syntax. And probably final thing I wanted to show here in app folder, queries. Queries for searching users. Search users get, actually let's take a look again where it's actually used. So probably it should be search users get somewhere for pagination. Not really sure, that's pretty weird thing. I haven't really done anything like that, but let's see how it actually is being used. This repository, okay, so in the test, okay, in the test, and then in admin controller, it's just used as an include file almost. Search users as a static class, so static class get search, so that's for searching the user. So Dries created a separate queries class, well, few classes, search users and search threads, I think, and it uses the same logic here in a controller. I'm not sure if I would do it this way. Probably I would extend a model or maybe a repository or even a scope inside of Eloquent, something like that. But maybe it does make sense if it's more complicated search. So I guess that's it. That is a short review of Laravel.io portal code. In short, if we stick to our topic of the course, which is how to structure Laravel code, excuse me, the main thing here is jobs. So in the controller, everything is called some logic and then some validation logic, and then the job is called, and everything mostly is located in app jobs folder. Hope this review was useful, and see you in the next review and in the next lesson of this course. In this video, we will have another review of existing open source project in Laravel to analyze its structure, its folders, its repositories, classes, and all of that. Maybe we will learn something. And today's project is Monica HQ, or just Monica. It's personal CRM created a year ago, I think, or 2 years ago. It looks like this. It's just kind of a CRM for your personal relationships. And it has open source GitHub version and also online version. It's kind of a commercial project, but on GitHub it has 6,000, more than 6,000 stars and a lot of forks, but also 300 issues. So this is an example. Usually what I've taken before, I've taken examples to analyze was accounting and Laravel.io. It was there were good examples to analyze for the code. In this case, it's not that good. I don't want to kind of shame on developers, on the colleagues, but there are things that are really questionable here in structure, and we will analyze that, and maybe there's a reason why they did it this way, but I'm pretty confident that those 300 issues are not just random ones. But yeah, let's dig deeper one by one. I usually start analyzing the project from routes. So let's go to routes and let's see what they have here. First that comes to mind is a lot of different files which are not really not default files. So API PHP and Web PHP are common thing, but those three are something special, and actually it's called special. So let's see what they have here. And special PHP, you have login form special, and some two-factor authentication stuff. I'm not sure why it's taken out of Web PHP into special. Okay, but fair enough, it's more convenient to them. Then DAV, I'm not sure what is DAV, but also something with DAV controller, not sure, no idea. And then OAuth, that may be, but also, I mean, a few routes here and there, and then a new developer. Well, actually, how I'm judging the project. Is it easy to understand for a new developer on a team, or for someone to handle the project, to take over the project? So in this case, it wouldn't be easy for me to find the route if I want to check that. But it works, and the way how it's all turned on, it's in route service provider. Probably we will see the boot here, and in the boot we have bind contact, some binding, also map. So the map function, that is the most important. So map API routes, web routes, and all of those 5, and every one of them has their own structure, namespace. Maybe that's the reason that why it was taken away. It was taken in a separate route. But anyway, here's the routes, and let's get back to routes and see the main routes web. Okay, and actually it's not only web, it's API as well, because Monica HQ has Vue.js layer, and we will get to that. But main routes web PHP is pretty big actually. It doesn't use route resources almost. So in some cases they use route resource, but only later in the route. So the project, as you can see, 200, almost 300 rows in routes. It's pretty big. So we will touch only some parts of that. If you want to analyze more, please clone the project locally and dive deeper. But here we can see in routes a lot of routes with a lot of every route is named, so that's a good thing. Also there are some names and prefixes. Here's the name, but we don't see any middleware here. So middlewares are probably in the controller, somewhere in the controller's constructor. And let's go to some controller, which I've chosen as the kind of the simplest one and the most separate and the easiest and the simplest and the shortest. Because there are a lot of controllers, and one of them is journal controller. So one of the function, I guess, is in that CRM is to have a journal, daily journal. And here we will have quite a mess, to be honest. But let's start one by one. First, Vue.js section. So this is index file, just returning the view, showing the journal index, but it's empty. It doesn't have any variables, doesn't have any nothing to put into index. So I assumed it's powered by some front end. So let's go to that resources, views, journal, and index blade. And as you can see, nothing here. So probably that is in Vue.js. So again, journal list is probably a component. So let's go to resources, assets, JS, and I'm guessing components, journal, journal list, I guess. Okay, template, yeah, journal entries, journal list, not sure where it's bound. Well, anyway, so this is the template for journal list, journal rate date. So a lot of Vue.js structure and syntax, and then they load the data with Axios get journal entries. And this is another thing that I'm not a fan of that. So if you're having API, please prefix that as API, because journal entries, maybe there are more, yeah, journal entries with page. So it's not prefixed as API. So there's no /API/journal/entries. And if we get to journal entries in routes, if we go back to our routes, routes, web, entries, journal entries, name list. So it's journal list. It's in the same routes web PHP. So it's not separated into routes API and then journal controller list. We get back to the same journal controller, and list is here. So the same controller is both for web and for API. So that is, in my opinion, pretty bad, because those should be separated. If you have like main web controllers and then API controllers, those should be separate. So we have two functions interacting with one another. So index calls the Vue.js, and then Vue.js gets the data from here. And we get to our list, and the list returns the array with pagination. It's all okay, maybe, but another thing which I dislike is the length and the size of that function list. That whole logic should be somewhere else. It shouldn't be in a controller. Controller should be as small as possible. And the data layer should be somewhere else. In this case, for API, it could be API resources class or something else. So for each loop, so pagination, then for each loop, there's some more variables, then collect. I haven't launched that project, to be honest. Locally, I'm just looking at the code. I'm judging here from the code. So I see the same thing as you do, and just judging here. So my overall kind of rant is just there should be service here or API resource. But see here, it's kind of using something externally. So to populate the total per page and current page does use journal entries, and journal entries is paginated account journal entries. Let's actually look in the whole project for next page URL. So next page URL in this repository, and let's see how it actually, so paginator, so that's vendor folder. Okay, so it's paginator thing per page. Yeah, so these entry, yeah, this is not a service, this is part of pagination function in Laravel. But anyway, I will shorten that function and move that to somewhere else. Next, get journal entry. I'm not even sure how to comment that. So journal entry is the the parameter to get. Actually, let's get to routes again. Routes. And let's see how it's called. Routes. Web, and we're looking for get journal entry in journal. So get, actually that's pretty, okay, journal get, let's see, where's that journal get? Yeah, this one. So journal entry is the parameter, and then it's doing get object data. Probably again it's a call for API resource, but let's see what is a journal entry. I'm actually jumping back and forth, but everything is tied together. So I see a question and I'm going to, actually let's keep the routes open, and in this tab let's go for journal entry. It's probably a model, I'm guessing. So app, let's see what model structure we have. We have models folder as a separate, okay, that's fine. Journal probably, so there are subfolders. Journal entry, there we go. So we have journal entry, and probably there should be a function get object data. Get object data here. Journalable type, so I guess it's a polymorphic relations because it has able syntax. So it has find or fail and then get info for journal entry. Okay, so where does it see? I'm struggling here. So I'm acting as the same developer new on a team, and I'm trying to understand the structure, and it's not easy to understand. So in a controller I get this parameter, which is instance of model journal entry, which gets me to here, and then I have to guess what are the types possible, and then corresponding objects, where should I find this? So get info for journal entry. Again, let's take a look at the whole project. Search in this repository. Data get info. Oh, it's an interface, so journal by interface, and that is fine. Testing is good. Yep, see day and journal entry. Yeah, so it's kind of an interface. So probably in every model that implements the interface journalable, you will see the function of get info for journal entry. That is kind of a good thing. I was struggling here, but I think it's a good example because in interface, for example, now I get it. So in journal, there are multiple types of entry. So there could be day entry, there could be just simple journal entry, whatever it's called, and everyone has its logic. So this in day model, journal entry is this. It's compiling some data. In journal entry model, the implementation would be different. So they have interface, they have polymorphic relationships, and they implement different the data entries, journal entries with a different model. So it does make sense to me, but it's not really easily readable or understandable. Okay, let's get back to our controller. Oh, one more thing. I'm looking at my notes here on my phone. Journal entry get object data. So as you can see here, journal entry here, there are functions inside of model, and I'm also not a fan of that. So get object data, add, okay, these are okay, these are relationships, these are properties, these are fine, but inside of the model they have add and get object data. Probably, if you ask me, that should be a repository, and that should be separated somewhere, or maybe even a service. So journal entry service. I'm not a fan of getting logic into models. In my opinion, models should be just kind of configuration for that database table. So table name, primary key, relationships, fillables, maybe some accessors and mutators. So everything that is provided by Eloquent. What is outside of Eloquent should be somewhere else, should be in a service or in a repository. And also another thing, kind of a code smell to me here is this. So this kind of tells me, I was explaining that in a chapter about solid principles. Don't remember which principle it is, but if you see instance of, it's probably a bad design, bad architecture, because it should be a parameter to this, and it should be it should be a function inside of that interface to resolve that instance. It sounds complicated, I know, but I mean it should be a different interface. So that's a thing I don't like either. What else do we have on my list? Also, models folder structure. So it's kind of confusing a little. So it has some models and then instance. What is an instance? Instance is database table, probably, and then so subfolders, and then there are instance special date, which is, I'm not sure why it's in instance folder. Maybe it does make sense, but for example, in journal, you have entry and journal entry. What is the difference? So actually, let's see, and maybe we'll find out. So entry also implements journal interface. Is journalable, and then journal entry just extends model. So this is not interfaced. Okay, and this is interfaced. Right, okay. I guess that makes sense, maybe, but it's not by intuition. I cannot guess. Model binding, also interesting thing. So there is some abstract class model binding to resolve something. Okay, I don't know how to comment that. Right, let's move on to my list. Right, we're getting to traits. So for example, let's get to our controller. Actually this thing, store day from journal controller, also that should be a service or API resource or something. And actually it is a service, new journal entry, but it's not a service, it's a model. So the same thing that we've seen earlier. So instance of a model and then add a day. So this does look like a service to me. It was put in a model function. This thing also trashing the day. Let's look at my notes. Let's see how it looks. So trash the day and delete journal entry. What is delete journal entry? It's a function, probably inside of this one, from what I remember. Delete. No, not even here. Okay, anyway, delete journal entry. This repository, public function, trait journalable. So that's why it's not in a model. I was looking for that in a model, but it's not there. So let's take a look at journalable, and then where is it in the model? It's an interface. So it's an interface, then it's a trait, and then it's inside of, should be inside of a model. No. Oh right, yeah. It's being called from a controller on a day model, and day model should be including the including that trait. So journal entry, journal day, it should be a day model. Okay. Day, and it includes traits journalable and uses journalable. So also not a perfectly clear pattern. So it uses a model, and then model uses a trait and then deletes the entry, and that trait contains the relationship of polymorphic morph many morph one, and then deleting journal entry is basically just using the model. Why is it not in some kind of a service? Because it even looks like Eloquent. It doesn't. Trait is usually used when you can reuse the same functionality in different models. In this case, inside of the trait, you have one model. You have journal entry. That's it. There's nothing else. So that's pretty weird. Again, I'm sorry. I want to apologize to the authors. Maybe the app itself is really used and it's really maybe profitable from a business point of view, but I see a lot of questions, and maybe it makes sense. Maybe a lot of different developers worked on this project. Maybe it was refactored and maybe some parts were left untouched. In big projects, and this project is pretty big, it's kind of a real-life typical scenario. It's code debt, I think it's called, and whatever you move forward with the code and then you don't clean up, you change your mind on some pattern, you implement new pattern, and the old pattern also stays kind of live. So it does make sense in real life perspective. Also making sense, it's an open source project, so I'm not sure if they earn money from it. If they don't, then probably it makes sense that they work on that, not in a perfect environment structure. They don't earn money, so it was more like an experimental project maybe. Anyway, back to the controller. So we will analyze journal controller, and then from here we will move to further patterns. This thing has rated. Another rant. Let's get back to rants. Sorry, it's in routes. So has rated, and it's probably API call. Journal has rated. Nothing more here. Now, return Boolean. Nope, it's returning a string, and string true or string not yet. Really? I mean, it should be like proper Boolean, true or false, or maybe try catch with an exception, or API resource transforming something. So this should be corresponding to the results. Yeah, so this is not a good pattern to return the data. Then I have a feeling that it was inconsistency maybe in different developers. Sometimes they use form requests. For example, for store day, there is a file days request for validation. And then in the same controllers down below, they use just a simple request and they use validator inside of controller. So additional 10 lines of code. So I guess I'm talking here more about consistency. So if you use whatever pattern, it's not even a pattern, it's well, it is a pattern, but it's not like design pattern, nothing fancy or nothing complicated, but just you're using the same structure, the same classes. So if you start to use form requests, try to use it everywhere. If you don't do that, then use validation in a controller, which I'm not a fan of. Again, controller should be as simple as possible and as small as possible, and that's why form requests appeared in Laravel, and that's why they make sense. But whatever you do, just be consistent, and then it will be easier for others to understand it. And next, in the same save function, so I would basically refactor the whole thing, the whole method. So this should be in form request, and this should be in a service. So that result of a service should be entry, because look what's happening here. New entry model, then they fill it in with more logic from request and from user. Then some check if there is a title, then we use a title, then we save that entry, and then we add a journal entry with a parameter of that entry. Oh, maybe then it makes sense for me now why it is different. So entry is also a model, which is database table, but journal entry is kind of a layer above. So it saves both entry and journal entry with the same parameters. But anyway, it's more complicated logic. It shouldn't be in a controller. It should be this entry service, for example, add. And even this, it does look like a service, but it's actually an eloquent model. So it should be journal entry service, add, parameter should be probably request, and then service does all the magic and implements all the logic. Right. Interesting part here that I keep repeating myself that there should be a service somewhere. They do have services. That's another general thought about this repository is they have a lot of patterns, and we didn't get to helpers and jobs. We'll get to that as well. But a lot of patterns, and they are all mixed together. Something is a model, something is an interface, something is a trait, something is a service, something is a helper, and everything is mixed together. So I would be more consistent in doing services. So there is one service, okay, activity statistics service, and that's actually a good example of using the service. That's how I use services usually for any calculations or any logic which should be outside of controller. And that is a good example. So activities with contact and time range. That is a good example of service. I wish they would have more services here in this repository. And let's take a look how it is used and where it is used. And let's look at it in this repository. Public function, so this is a service. It's used in test. That's great. That's great that they have test. And then activities controller. They have statistics service in construct as dependency. That's great. That's good words about them. And then they do where is that used? Sorry, here. Oh yeah, the service is used activities in here. So public function year. Probably it's a statistic for a year. Activities controllers for a year. Then a lot of calls to service functionality. So that is a good example of a controller, smaller controller. Everything, all the logic is in a service, and then it's passing to the view. So that is a good example of service. So I wish they would have more of those here. Okay, let's go further. App services. Let's get back to app services. Actually no. Base service. I have a note here that they have base service. Base service. App services base service. Why is it not there? So it does app services. Wait, did I move somewhere else? App services. Okay, for some reason those were missing. Oh, because I came from the search. Of course. So yeah, they have more services. So that is one statistic service. And then yeah, they have base service here, abstract class with some function, well, just two functions for rules and validations. They have service, for example, for count, destroy all documents. Okay, that is a good example. No. Okay, let's take a look. It's loading. Maybe my internet is slower. Not sure. Okay, let's go back maybe. Services. Okay, let's open another user. Oh yeah, it has opened. Yeah, my internet broke down for a second. Right. So destroy all documents is a service that extends the same base service, and there is a function execute. So validate something, then see where the document is by account, and then delete the documents. In this case, I would prefer that to be a job, because it feels more like a job. Service is, in my opinion, for getting the data, for calculations, for logic, like doing for each loops for something. more for taking the data or managing the data. If you're executing something, like store something somewhere, in this case, execute destroying the document, and I had another examples here. Another example, services, we get to services back, we had user, email change. So email is changed, and executing the email changed with sending the verification. Okay, so it does feel more like a job than a service. So dispatching the job from the controller, that would make more sense. It's not a bad thing here. Service is better than that logic in a controller or in a model. Service is better, but I would personally do that as a job. Right, so this thing, and then, yeah, so that's it. Services and jobs are two things that I wanted to touch here. So actually, let's take a look. Maybe they have jobs. App, jobs. Oh, look at that. So they do have jobs. Another inconsistency of this repository is they have a job. For example, export everything as SQL. Export all as SQL. So they're populating the insert into SQL file and storing it on disk. Okay, that does feel like a job and it's good. But why that service of email change or another one is not a job? Why it is in a service? That's an open question. Right. Another layer we do have is helpers. We also have helpers, and quite a lot of them. So DB helper, probably you will see that in a controller somewhere. Helper, date helper. So date helper is the example. So yeah, get time zone. So inside of controller, some helper is used. So let's get to that date helper, and let's see what it provides to us. Static function, set locale, parse date time, parse date. So it's probably expecting carbon, but maybe it's not a carbon, so it's kind of a layer to parse carbon or other date type. Get timestamp. Okay, I don't know the logic why it is here, but it's okay. It's a helper with a lot of functions, so 300 lines of code, and it's all used with static call, so they don't really it's not an instance of anything. It's just a helper, general helper, and that's okay. Maybe it makes sense to have a service for that, but it's a matter of preference. In this case, I do agree with that helper pattern and logic. It's all in helpers folder. It's all divided by classes. It's all understandable. It's all, for example, used in a controller, so it's easy to find. And usually those helper functions, from what I've seen here, they're short, understandable, and readable. So this is a good example of using helpers. Okay, then we have console commands, app console commands. Console commands, yeah, app console commands. Yeah, a lot of commands, and this is okay. Calculate statistics, for example. I've made a note here, calculate statistics. And another thing which I haven't mentioned yet here in this video is using DB table. Why use DB table when you have eloquent models? Maybe for some performance, I do get that some eloquent layers and some eloquent functionality hits the performance, but in this case, DB table users count or user model count, not sure why it is used here, DB table. Then if you want to get to performance, then it should be raw query. So raw query, so count probably is not, it should be select ID, select count ID or something, and it should be a raw query if you want to count all the statistics. Also another pattern here, another pattern here is events and listeners. So there's one event, recovery login. So recovery login is an event that is happening in recovery login, and it's probably introduced in app service providers event service provider. Let's take a look. Let's look for recovery login. And wait, we have more here. So recovery login isn't even here. Recovery, nope, we're not finding that recovery login class. Instead of that, we have a lot of system classes. So that's another way. I haven't seen that. Maybe it's okay. Maybe you can judge. You can add the comments under this video. Maybe it's okay, but I haven't done that personally myself. So listening for some system events and implementing some logic. So for example, on login, so when someone logs in, we have a listener for login listener. And let's take a look what is happening there. App listeners, login listener. Oh, recovery login listener. It's here, but it's not registered. So probably it was created, but not really used. Anyway, let's take a look at login listener. And right, so it's for double, okay, for two-factor verification, two-factor login. Maybe it makes sense. I've implemented the two-factor verification in a different way. Okay. Yeah, so basically what I'm saying here is events and listeners are used in this repository in this project, but mostly listening for Illuminate, which is vendor folder event. So for system events, for notification sent, for another notification sent. Not sure why. Probably I wouldn't use listener here. I would probably, for example, on login, you can add a function in login controller probably, or extend the trade. So yeah, in login controller, you should probably add an event authenticated, I think it is, or in middleware authenticated. I don't remember exactly, but it can be overridden in the controller or in middleware. So that, and I guess that's it. I mean, one note I've missed. Another controller that I wanted to show you, pretty huge one. It's settings controller, app HTTP controllers, settings controller. It's for changing settings. You can see just from this list how much logic is here. But for example, delete setting and reset setting, and they are pretty similar. Delete setting and reset setting. So controller function, and this is a perfect example of a mess in this project. So it's kind of a symbolic end of this video. Look at what's happening here. They don't use validation for request. They launch a service, which is okay, destroy all documents, or was it a job? I think it was a job. Then they use helper to get the tables. Then they use DB table. Then so for each looping the table, deleting the entries in those table. Then account subscription cancel. It's a function, or is subscribe, is inside of the model, is model account probably, or not even sure. And then user force delete, and then redirect back. So even in one method, there are at least a few patterns, and those should be, so all of that functionality should be somewhere else. So this should be one method probably in a service. This is okay actually. And this is probably okay, or maybe I would pass the whole account here, or user account. So deleting that line. Then this should be one service method. Subscription cancellation, account, and then account here, and then account here again. That's interesting. So yeah, this one probably another user force delete. So deleting the user is another service, somewhere account service, delete user, something like that. And pretty similar in reset. So reset method. So delete, destroy all documents, delete something, populate the fields, and all of that. So my overall judgment of this repository, of this project, you can learn the syntax, how it all works and how it all is tied together. So it's a good repository to learn the syntax of services, jobs, models, traits, and all of that. But it's not a perfect example of how is it all tied together, how is it called, and the consistency. I hope the authors will forgive me for that video, and it won't be public, it will be only inside of this course. But this is an example of not that good implementation. If you have any comments how it would be structured differently, or if you dislike this video, also comment inside of the course. But yep, there was a review of Monica HQ, and that was the last review in this course. And last thing I wanted to show you is where else you can learn from other code bases. This is a repository called Awesome Laravel. Awesome Laravel, with a lot of links to some articles, tutorials, everything. And one of those one of the sections is code bases for reference. So there are quite a few open source projects here which you can analyze. I've chosen Laravel.io, Accounting, and Monica. Some of them are abandoned or not even working. Also, you can take a look at content management systems, and you can analyze more open source projects and more code structures for your future reference.